Lovely. As I was saying, a very warm welcome to everyone for this second of our two events this evening. Some of you, I think, may have been at the first one, and there may be some quite interesting connections to be made, which perhaps we can pick up on later. But my main task is to introduce the proceedings in hand and then to hand over to Norbert Meyn. As some of you may know, I'm the initiator and director of a project called Insiders Outsiders, which originally took the form of a year-long nationwide face-to-face multidisciplinary Arts Festival in the UK from March 2019 to March 2020. Then, of course, COVID hit, luckily, just as the festival was coming to a natural end anyway. And the blessing in disguise, I suppose, if one could put it that way, is that we were prompted to go online and to initiate what's very much an ongoing series of virtual events on a whole range of subjects related to the overarching theme of Insiders Outsiders, which is to pay tribute in a nuanced and thoughtful way to the immense contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to British culture and indeed beyond, as we have discovered there is plenty of potential there. Norbert, who I will introduce in a minute, has been a staunch ally from the very start. Norbert, I'm terribly grateful. I'm an art historian, the visual arts, the fine arts in particular are my area, my comfort zone, as it were. Norbert is very much my music man, if I can put it that way, and it's been a great pleasure to work with him on a number of other occasions before. I will mention, just while I think about it, that as well as this event, there are quite a lot of music related events that have been recorded and uploaded onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which you may like to check out for yourselves at a later date. Many of you, I suspect, will already know Norbert, but let me just introduce him very briefly. He's a professional singer, a tenor, and teacher at the Royal College of Music. And most importantly, for our purposes, some years ago, Norbert, what year was it when you initiated the Singing a Song project? It's already a good few years, isn't it?
Well, I think the first time we were really engaged with that history was in 2012, which is it's already 9 years ago, which is a long time.
Indeed. Anyway, yes, so the original project was called Singing a Song in a Foreign Land. What a lovely title. And as the name suggests, it was dedicated to exploring the lives and, of course, the musical achievements and careers of a whole range of emigre composers, musicians, and also involved interviews with those on the ground here in this country who had helped and worked with them. And as a kind of offshoot of that, with wonderfully, invidiously generous funding, I have to say, Norbert is now in charge of a project, again, under the auspices of the Royal College of Music, called Music, Migration and Mobility. And indeed, much of what we're going to hear about today will be about where that project is going next. So I very much look forward to that. But there's much more in store. So Norbert, without further ado, let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Monica, and good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see you, and that we can live in this new Zoom world and be together this evening from many places in the world, which is still a miracle to me. Monica's already said that our project currently, it's a 3-year project which became a bit longer because of the pandemic, investigates the legacy of migrant musicians from Nazi Europe in Britain. And we do this through performance, we do this through archival research, and also through interdisciplinary work with geography and music and humanities research. So this evening's event is going to show you a little bit of the interdisciplinary work we've been doing. And I just wanted to point out really one of the objectives of our project, not apart from engaging with the history and finding working with historical sources, is to develop innovative ways of displaying and disseminating the multifaceted narratives of these musicians' lives as a means of advancing ongoing debates about migration, mobility, and culture formation in general. So this was a very academic sentence, but I hope that it gives the context for what we're trying to do this evening. So I would like to introduce my team colleague, Michael Holden, who is, he is our research associate, postdoctoral research associate based at Royal Holloway University of London. And he's based in the geography department at Royal Holloway. He studied English literature at the University of Sheffield, and then just recently completed his PhD about the use of cartography in Holocaust memory and Holocaust research. So he's now joined our project, and he's been working quite intensely on the history of the internment, and also on ways of displaying this history in connection with music. And I'm going to hand over to Michael now. Thank you, Michael, so much for preparing this presentation for this evening. And ladies and gentlemen, we are, this is a first for us to engage with this kind of audience. So we are looking for your feedback later on as well. So I just wanted to say that straight away.
Thank you very much, Norbert. Hello, everyone. I think I'll just very briefly try and make sure I'm sharing the right slides. Has that worked? Can you see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you for having us this evening. I'd like to say thanks to Monica and Eva for inviting us to be a part of this year's Insiders Outsiders. My name is Michael Holden, as Norbert's just said, and I'm based at Royal Holloway in the Department of Geography. Where I'm working on the Music, Migration and Mobility project. I think that our project really, in some ways, kind of shares some very strong affinities with Insiders Outsiders. But of course, as Norbert's mentioned, we are a research project that is aiming to investigate the legacy of refugee and migrant musicians who left Nazi-occupied Europe or Nazi Europe for Britain. And of course, internment was a significant part of this story for many individuals, and this is what we're here to talk about today. And the title that I've chosen for my section, or my first section of this event, Music at the End of the World, paraphrases some words used in the internment diaries of the composer Hans Gál, at a moment in which he reflects on writing music whilst imprisoned in internment camps, particularly within the wider context of wartime. And he says, "Here I am, writing music, completely superfluous, ridiculous, fantastic music for a flute and 2 violins, while the world is on the point of coming to an end." And I'll refer to Dr. Gál and his journey again a little more later on. And we'll be hearing much more about him from his daughter, Eva Fox-Gál, in a short while. But I thought that these words were quite apt because they capture something of the ambivalences of the internment process, but also refer to the act of creation, which will be an important consideration throughout much of what I'm about to say, particularly in relation to music. So what I'll be doing here for the first 10 minutes or so is providing a bit of a brief introduction to some of the ways in which we've been thinking about music within internment as part of our project. And then in addition, later on in this evening's event, I'd also like to talk to you about some of our own creative and research practices and the ways in which cross-disciplinary thinking and methods has allowed us to approach the story of music and internment from perhaps, I suppose you could say, kind of a slightly different angle, maybe. So on that note, I'll be describing the process of translating some of these stories into digital maps. And then following on from that, I'll be briefly explaining how we worked with our colleague, Giada Patele from the University of Padua, in order to transform some of these same stories into illustrated comics. Of course, our talk today is part of a series of events that relate to internment, and obviously we're focusing specifically on music. So I'm not going to go into any detail about the origins of mass internment as a government policy or how it was put into practice. But I would like to begin by considering a little bit about considering how internees might have felt about what was happening to them. So I've already alluded briefly to the ambivalences that characterised internment, and this is perhaps particularly true of internees' own reactions to it. The Rachel Pistol, who I know has spoken about internment at previous Insiders Outsiders events, has shown very clearly through some of her research the spectrum of opinions and emotions that were held by internees with regard to what was happening to them when they found themselves arrested and held without trial. At a fundamental level, there was frequently a conflict between a sense of gratitude for the refuge offered by the UK on the part of those who'd been fortunate enough to escape the continent, and the immense frustration and indignation felt at the injustice of indiscriminate internment, which, as we know, resulted in the arrests of many people who had been actively anti-Nazi or indeed had already experienced persecution at the hands of the Nazis in Germany, Austria and elsewhere for a variety of reasons, but most often simply for being Jewish. Beyond this kind of fundamental tension, Dr. Pistel has also demonstrated how, for some, particularly younger internees, the experience proved enriching and positive, an opportunity to come into contact with renowned and respected figures from the worlds of music, art, writing, science, and more. But by contrast, many of the older internees, perhaps those with more significant commitments around work, family, and finances, for example, found internment immensely frustrating and at times claustrophobic to the point of despair. In a roundabout way, this contrast in opinion points us towards another of what I see as the key ambivalences of internment camp life, namely the development of cultural and creative activities within much of the camp network. Virtually without exception, internment camps across the UK saw the development of some form of cultural life, usually including a camp university within which lectures would be given by inmates, the development of musical programmes and other performances, the production of artworks such as the woodblock print by Helmut Weissenborn that we can see here, and writing and journalism in the form of camp newspapers and so on. And this was typically the source of the enrichment and growth experienced most acutely by younger internees, as they were able to learn from experienced professionals. And yet, at the same time, the vibrant cultural life that emerged was itself born of necessity. It was a mechanism for alleviating boredom, for developing a sense of purpose that otherwise seemed lost, and for punctuating the monotony of internment with moments of enjoyment. Suzanne Snitzek, in her research, has used the term art as advantage to summarize the benefits derived from cultural activity, suggesting that such creative and cultural endeavors had the effect of smoothing out the roughness of the experience of internment for those who were fortunate enough to be in a position to contribute meaningfully to this cultural activity. In effect, a difficult episode in life was made slightly more bearable for those who were in a position to create. Of the forms of cultural activity that emerged, music was perhaps the most visible, or certainly audible, as the case may be, and it was definitely one of the most communal. And it ranged in its production from the formal to the informal, thereby thoroughly permeating the space of the camps. To provide but a few examples, professional composers such as Peter Gellhorn and Hans Gál produced works within internment. So Gellhorn produced Andante, Cats and Murrah whilst interned in Murrah Camp to the north of the Isle of Man, whilst Gál produced his Huyton Suite in Huyton Camp near Liverpool and wrote the music for the revue What a Life in Central Camp in the capital of the Isle of Man, Douglas. And we'll be hearing some new recordings of pieces from What a Life in a little while. These compositions were profoundly influenced by the material conditions of internment. So in his diaries, Gál describes in detail the challenges of writing the Huyton Suite, for example, noting the difficulty of writing for just a flute and 2 violins, as these were the only instruments available to him at that time. Similarly, Gellhorn's Murrah, a work composed specifically for male voices, was necessarily limited by the all-male makeup of the camp's population. Music's penetration into camp life was not limited to professionals, however. So in Gál's diary, he describes the cacophony that resulted from internees hammering on pianos upon their transfer to the Isle of Man from Huyton, having been starved of musical instruments upon which to practice in their previous camp. Similarly, in the diaries of Wilhelm Hollitscher, we hear of the regularity of music recitals performed by professionals and amateurs alike, which are described fondly as a welcome distraction from the tedious nature of camp life. The prevalence of musical life within the camps is testament to the notion of music as a mobile form of art. Research into the role played by music in the lives of migrants and similarly mobile people has often highlighted this characteristic and stressed its value for displaced peoples as a bridge of connection to some time before the present. So David B. Copland, for instance, in his study of internal migrant workers in Lesotho, has noted how certain forms of poetic song allow these mobile individuals to map and track their experiences of more or less voluntary movement. Dominic Simmons, meanwhile, has demonstrated through his research into Eastern European migrant communities in Lincolnshire how music recalled from home forges a link between the here of the present and the there of the past. This connection, Simmons suggests, serves to bolster group identity, strengthen ties of community, and provide a fond link to a distant home, but at the same time it can also serve to heighten feelings of alienation in a new locale. Such studies highlight the portability of music then, which contributes directly to the role that it can play as a marker of identity for mobile peoples. Of course, in the situation of British internment, this portability of music is coupled with a higher than usual concentration of professional musicians, academic musicologists, and so on, resulting partly from the typical cultural and class makeup of those who are fortunate enough to escape from persecution on the continent. In addition, we find a strongly defined cultural background shared between internees from Germany and Central Europe. This is perhaps particularly true of music, with many internees being steeped in the Germanic tradition of classical music making. This quote from the work of Philip Kasinitz and Marco Martiniello reflects this situation and recalls the image of regular music recitals held within internment camps. Elsewhere in his diaries, Hans Gál notes that, quote, "the people are starved of music. When I play Bach or Beethoven, there is a reverence such as I've rarely experienced in music making," end quote. This image of a rapt audience starved of music is strongly suggestive of precisely this kind of social, identity building, emotional connection, here born out of the shared heritage that I described a moment ago. And we might view this as going some way toward explaining, partly, the imperative to create felt by figures such as Gál and Gellhorn in this context. As such, what might otherwise have been transitory, fleeting moments of musicality are, through their production and performance, preserved for posterity and become a unique record of a particular moment in history, specific to particular places, and indeed particular spaces too, such as those in which they were performed, rehearsed, and composed. And that's it from me for the moment. And I'm going to hand back over to Norbert now, and we'll soon be hearing some of the music that I've just been describing. But I believe first that Norbert's going to be having a conversation with Hans Gál's daughter, Eva.
Thank you very much, Michael. And so now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Eva Fox-Gál. Eva was born in Edinburgh as the third child of the composer Hans Gál and his wife Hannah. And Eva grew up in Edinburgh bilingually. And Eva studied modern languages, mostly German, at the University of Edinburgh. And then from 1971 to 2001, for 30 years, she taught literature at the University of York with a special interest in comparative literature. So it's the university where Michael, until very recently, did his PhD. So since then, Eva, your main career has been as a homeopathist and nutritionist, and also, of course, as a very, very important campaigner, really, for your father's legacy as the honorary vice president of the Hans Gál Society, which was founded in 2005. So my first question really is, or what I would like to ask you, or perhaps we can do it together, is to introduce your father as a composer and try to outline his significance in music. Michael just mentioned Peter Gellhorn alongside your father. We know both of them composed, but the difference was, of course, that Peter Gellhorn was a very, very young musician when he was interned and had only just finished his studies, whereas your father had already, quite a professional legacy behind him that was significant, and that made him a very revered figure as a composer and as a musician in the camp and indeed beyond it. So could you perhaps give a brief outline of his career before the internment as well, and also mention some of the main works that or his the scope of his work as a composer?
Well, his whole persona really it comes from before the First World War. He already had considerable success at the outbreak of war, including a concert in Vienna devoted entirely to his music, and then winning the Austrian State Prize for Composition in 1915. So I think that he started early. But one thing that he remained grateful for, actually, was that in spite of the absolute horror of the First World War, that it did give him an enforced detachment from his early work, and and he was not able to publish his work really until after the war had ended. And that meant that he was then very, very critical about sifting out those works that he did not want to include. But he composed important works during the war itself, including his first published opera, which he brought back a completed manuscript from the war, and it had a first performance in 1919. His first published quartet stems from 1916. One of his most popular sets of piano duets was from Belgrade, where he was posted, the Serbische Weisen, Serbian melodies, and so on. So immensely prolific as a composer, and then after the war, still perhaps with opera at the center. He composed 3 more major operas, but he also composed throughout his life symphonies, a huge number of choral works, a very large number of chamber works, so 4 published symphonies, 4 published string quartets, sonatas for various instruments, trios, of which the one composed in the internment was one. As I said, a host of choral works. He particularly championed what he called vocal chamber music. And from very early on, that's amongst his earliest published works. And he was a pianist first and foremost, so there's also a huge amount of piano music. So a very large compositional output, which continued in this country. I mean, more than half of his published works were actually composed in this country, and including still composing in his late 80s and into his 90s. 2 major quintets, a clarinet quintet and a string quintet, in 1976 and 7, I think, which he said after that he had closed his workshop, but actually he then produced 24 fugues as a present to himself for his 90th birthday. And then unaccompanied cello works and unaccompanied recorder works. Yeah, he wrote a lot also for popular instruments like mandolin, a huge amount of mandolins, ensemble work for which there was demand in the 60s when there was little demand in the classical music world for the kind of music he wrote, and also a great deal for recorder and recorder ensembles. Carl Dolmetsch had a Wigmore concert every year for which my father composed a lot. So huge compositional output.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's also, I mean, he also had his professional career in the 1920s was, significant, and he had a very important position as the director of the conservatoire in Mainz in Germany, a position which he, held and was very, very highly respected in. And of course, he was removed from this position in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, and then moved back to Vienna for a short time. But perhaps you could say a few words about his actual emigration and your family's emigration to Britain, and also how internment happened to him, and then moving on to the story of the diary, this wonderful diary that he wrote in internment, which of course was published, and we're going to talk about in a moment.
So in 1933, when he was summarily dismissed from his post, literally from the 29th of March, so that he could no longer conduct a concert with the college choir and orchestra on the 30th. This was a man who had just the previous month attended the premiere of his violin concerto very successfully, and on his way back attended an event celebrating the 50th anniversary of Wagner's death, at which Hitler appeared, and my father was sitting fairly close to Hitler and kept kind of looking at him and thinking, surely the German people cannot fall for that face. And of course, he was wrong. So that's the first thing, that he had really underestimated the extent to which Hitler was able to consolidate his power. Also, his post had just been renewed for another 2 years in February 33. So to be dismissed at the end of March came as a great shock. Anyway, I mean, they went back to Vienna. That was not a good time. He was unable to get any professional position and had to really make do with teaching and occasional work, editing, bit of conducting, and so on. So in by 1938, when the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria to the German Reich, was actually declared, my parents knew they had to leave immediately. And my mother, she went on her own in what must have been an absolute nightmare journey to see if the borders were still open, because she reckoned it was safer for her than for a man. But people were kind of summarily removed from the carriage pretty arbitrarily by SS guards, and it was all very nerve-wracking. My father stayed in Vienna for that extra week in time to see Hitler being hailed as a kind of savior in Vienna, and he got out safely a week after my mother, but was detained and put into detention for a whole week when he arrived in Britain. So all too similar to what's kind of happening these days to asylum seekers and refugees. He'd be turning in his grave right now, but that's been going on for several years now. So that was not a good start, but Sir Ernest Gombrich, who they knew from Vienna, my mother was able to get in touch with him. They must have known each other's address, and he had already been in Britain a bit longer, and he guaranteed for my father, so he got out, but I think he must have been in quite a dreadful state. And yes, so I mean, do you want to go straight on to the internment? I know we don't have long.
Well, I think perhaps we should mention that, of course, your father then found some support in Edinburgh and was able to move the family to Edinburgh as well.
Well, he found 6 months temporary work through Professor Tovey, who managed to get a visa. I mean, the refugees were not allowed to work, neither paid nor unpaid. So that was a big deal for Tovey to get that visa for 6 months, and then he went back to London, and it was at the start of war. Yeah, by then they decided to give up their visas to America, which is what they were going to do because the war started, and it was with the nightly sirens that affected particularly the younger son, that they decided to leave London and found accommodation with the retired professor of English, Sir Herbert Grierson, and yes, that brought them back to Edinburgh, which my father had really liked during his 6 months temporary work cataloguing a library. And he always said that that work in the library laid the foundation for all the books that he later wrote. In the 60s, again, from 60s and 70s, when there was little interest in the kind of tonal music that he wrote, very much still within the Austro-German tradition, which was unfashionable, he wrote a lot of books.
And they were, I mean, he was really, really influential with these monographs, and his book on Schubert and, you know, on Brahms, you know, these monographs are really, really important and were very influential in Britain in opening people's minds to the sort of context of these composers.
And really in Germany these days, particularly, even more so than here, he is associated with his books, not with his music. Now that was very, very different in the 20s, when his most successful opera was in the repertoire from 1923 to 1933. Throughout those 10 years, which was actually unusual given the amount of new operas. So yes, I mean, Schubert, Brahms, Wagner, Verdi, letters of great composers, but actually he wrote a first book in 1948, The Musician's World. Sorry, wrong book. The Golden Age of Vienna, edited by Otto Erich Deutsch, who was interned with him. So I've got to internment.
Good, thank you. So the internment, that I mean, obviously, you know, that what had happened to him, he was such a wonderful writer, and because of that, his diary, which he, you know, wrote during the experience of internment, is such an extraordinary document. And perhaps you could tell us a bit about, you know, how this diary, you know, how you came across it in the end, and also how you went about translating it into English and publishing it, and then we can talk a little bit about the content of it, and of course especially the story of What a Life, the revue that he composed while he was interned.
Well, the diary, it has to be said, is the only diary I'm aware of him keeping in his entire life. The internment was probably the worst period of his life. I think for him it was much worse than the First World War, because at least in the First World War he was an unlikely lieutenant and had some power, whereas as an internee they were completely powerless, and he was so conscious of the folly of the whole enterprise and so on. So I think that was very difficult for him, and also he was the sort of person who couldn't sleep on a bare floor, and you know, when they had the luxury of straw mattresses and all of that. Yes, internment was very, very difficult for him. But it did also have its high point, because he was someone with a great many inner resources, and eventually found music again. Initially, that had just really disappeared from him. But you know, when the spirit moved him again, 4th of June, and he was interned on the 12th of May, he then, in a matter of days, wrote a trio. So, I mean, the diary is literally the only quasi-autobiographical thing by him that we have. He did not normally write diaries. This was purely for himself, in shorthand, probably as some way of expressing, and then in that sense literally getting out of his system something very painful. And I think that's why he typed it up when he emerged from, when he was released from the internment. But it was only, you know, typed with carbon paper for a copy for each of his roommates. There was him and 3 other fellow Viennese, all good friends, very good friends. And those were the sole copies. And it was very emphatically for private use, for their own use only. Now, I was sent it by him a few years before his death. And I started reading it and found it just tremendously emotionally upsetting, really. And I just didn't have time then. I had, you know, a full-time job and 2 children and 2 instruments each, to somehow get practiced or not. And it was just all too much. So I didn't actually read it fully until after he died. I mean, he sent it to me with a very understated sort of note saying, I just got this out again because an interviewer is coming tomorrow and found all sorts of things that might interest you. I'll be very sparing with my comments to the interviewer. And that was it. You know, I just thought this might interest you. It's actually of huge interest, but the way I set about it, because it was so emphatically intended not for publication, I showed it first to people who had been interned with him, who were still alive. And they were all very much in favor, really. And then I started showing it to people who hadn't experienced the internment, just to see how they would react. And it really is just of such general human and historical interest, as well as, I think, being very insightful about music. And as I say, it's the only sort of such personal document by Hans Gál. And in the camp, he was, his friends, or his roommates rather, occupied a very central sort of position within the camp administration, and his friends, the main people administering the camp, were very close to him, and also he was right at the hub of all musical activity.
And what makes this diary so special? I mean, and I must say, I when I read it first in German and then again in your English translation, which is also excellently contextualized. So in the English version, there is a lot more context information and biographies of some of the people mentioned in the book. I found it also incredibly fascinating on different layers, really. And the story of the Revue What a Life, which of course happened during the last stage of his time in internment. And in fact, you know, he had to write the music for this revue, which was a project of Georg Höllering, a theatre producer and later cinema owner in London, who had worked with Bertolt Brecht in Berlin on Kuhle Wampe, and was in that style of cabaret, an experienced theatre man. And Georg Höllering quite insistently put him up to writing this music while he was, in fact, most of the time in the camp hospital, so that whole story of the significance of this musical creativity in this under these really dire circumstances, and the enormous meaning that had for the internees there, and also actually for the captors, so to speak, because it was bilingual, the review, in English and German, and how the intensity of the striving to get the best quality out of this review, motivated everybody and actually brought everybody together. It is an extreme. It's an almost, on the one hand, it's one of the most, humiliating situations to find yourself in this captivity, in the uncertainty in internment. There was very little communication with families outside. It was all censored. People were really anxious that the Nazis may actually capture Britain or capture the Isle of Man, and you would be the internees would be served up as as fodder for the Nazi machine, and at the same time, the dignity and the camaraderie, the almost utopian feeling, which your father describes, especially very movingly at the end of the diary, when he is on the boat going away from the island, after he had asked to be allowed to stay an extra day to be able to conduct the second performance of this revue, What a Life. So for me, that is a hugely exciting sort of moment in the history of this whole generation of emigres in Britain, and it moved me on many levels. So I wanted to, before we move on to some music from this review, I wanted to ask you to actually show us the book, Eva, and also point out to everybody that we have put the link to the Hans Gál Society, hansgál.org, or it also works as hansgál.com, into the chat of the Zoom meeting. And if you're interested in getting this book, which Eva can show you, you can buy it you contact the Hans Gál Society and you can buy it for a reduced price of £20. And Eva can quickly show you what it looks like.
I mean, I know I am biased, but it is a tremendously good read. That's all I can say. And it is very, very nicely produced, this English version of it. So I don't know if that works.
We can see it very well, and it's called Music Behind Barbed Wire by Hans Gál, published by Toccata Press, and it's available from the Hans Gál Society, but also from other publishers and other platforms. I
mean, it reads very much like a war novel, because the vignettes of the characters, the people come alive in it, and they really are like characters you become involved with, and also it's a sort of a combination of horror at the events that were taking place, the deportations with various transports overseas, and all the rest of it, and all the different injustices that were going on, and at the same time interspersed with a huge amount of creativity and shared music making. Mm-hmm. Initially, there was no music there, but my father was able to provide so much that he knew from memory. So when there was a good singer, he could write the songs for him, or the leader, because he'd been accompanying leader all his life. And the account of the writing, in fact, both of the Haydn's suite of the trio for flute and two violins and the review, he worked with tremendous speed. The songs in the review, he describes, writing them while Georg Höllering was there with the texts, because it just immediately turned into music for him. Right. And this was while he was in hospital with this dreadful eczema, which is why he was hospitalized for the whole last part of the internment. he was in hospital.
Yeah. So just to introduce a couple of pieces now from this review. The first one is called The Song of the Barbed Wire. And the text exists originally in German, but also was translated into English. So the verses in both languages. And this is extraordinary because it uses the seagull as a sort of image of freedom, and you know, it takes a bird's eye view of the situation by saying, you know, the seagulls are strangely bewildered why all this barbed wire is growing on the beach, and so that's a very you know, image that actually turns up also in the music of Peter Gellhorn, who wrote this piece about the gulls being able to fly freely. So this is the Song of the Barbed Wire, and this was recorded as or filmed at a recording session this summer, and you may need to turn up the volume on your computers to be able to hear it. I apologize in advance that the sound is not particularly loud, but I hope you can hear it, and I will share it now.
The seagulls are in a curious mood. Maybe they are getting too much food. One thing they all very much deplore is the ugly barbed wire that grows up the shore. So in the seagulls' parliament there was a great debate on that end, and many of them did then inquire, why are human beings behind a wire? Yeah! Why are human beings behind a wire? Die Möwen sehen den Stacheldraht, den man in Douglas errichtet hat. Und weil kein Draht hier früher war, ist ihnen der Zweck des Drahtes nicht klar. Sie debattieren mit viel Geschrei, was wohl der Sinn des Drahtes sei, und kommen zu keinem Resultat. Warum lebt der Mensch hinter Stacheldraht? Ja! Warum lebt der Mensch hinter Stacheldraht?
And that was with the flautist Ashley Solomon and the pianist Christopher Gould. And a second song from the revue is called Keep Fit. And that's very much a comedy number where they're making fun of the morning exercise that happened, you know, on the seafront every morning. And perhaps one thing to mention is that the staging of these numbers was quite elaborate, and they had a stage in the Palace Theatre which seated up to 2,000 people. And they used cardboard cutouts, and they also used the actual suitcases, which were the only sort of large possessions that each of these internees had. They used these suitcases to build a sort of cubic structures on the stage. We do not know exactly what the stage looked like, and the dialogue from the revue doesn't actually survive. But we have some descriptions from Hans Gál's diary as to what this looked like. And but I've got a clip from a performance at the Royal College of Music in 2012, which did have some staging. And so here it comes. Let's Keep Fit. And that was the tenor Peter Kirk and the pianist Ian Tyndale. So this concludes this part of the event, and thank you very much, Eva, of course, for sharing your memories and thoughts. And I'm now going to hand back to Michael Holden for the final part of this presentation, and then we can have some questions and answers, I think.
Thank you very much. Can we see that? Okay, is that working? Good. Hello again. So I think I'll jump straight in to make sure we've got enough time for questions at the end. But earlier I left off on the idea of music's portability and some of the ways in which the music produced in internment was inherently influenced by the social and spatial realities of the internment camps. And a crucial question for our research project, given our focus not only upon music, but also upon the geographies of migratory individuals fleeing from Nazism, was how to capture multiple strands of the internment story whilst keeping concerns such as mobility and music in focus simultaneously. And one solution that we've been experimenting with is the creation of story maps, which is a key part of my own role within the project. Very briefly, story maps are in effect digital interactive maps that combine cartography with narratives, images, videos, and other forms of media in order to create an holistic picture of particular geographic narratives. And as I progress through this part of the event, there'll be some videos of story maps in action, if you like, playing on the slides in order to give a demonstration of how they work. Although I would stress that I certainly wouldn't expect everyone to read read everything on these videos, because they do move quite quickly. And they're really just there to kind of provide an illustration of some of the things that I'll be talking about. But the story maps themselves will be available to access online very soon. So at that point, it will be possible to explore them properly for yourselves if that's something that you'd like to do. And there'll be a link to where you'll be able to access that at the end of these slides. Just before I do go on to talk about our work on these maps, however, I'd just like to take a very, very quick detour to explore why maps can be a useful vessel for storytelling. But I'll try to keep this fairly brief. So I'd like to begin with the perhaps slightly counterintuitive notion that maps aren't ever really neutral representations of space. And now obviously the example on this slide that I've picked to illustrate this point, which is this Mappa Mundi artwork by Grayson Perry, is quite an extreme and exaggerated example of the potential subjectivity of maps. But even the most ostensibly scientific and supposedly neutral map is always the result of particular choices made on the part of a map maker. And so actually narrative is always a part of any map anyway, given that each one inherently tells a particular story about a place or set of places. But beyond this, certain academic fields that deal with maps have recently put forth the idea that a map isn't simply a finished static object, but rather they are or can be dynamic texts that are remade or reimagined every time that they're engaged with. And again, I'm not going to go into too much of the detail on this because it's not really directly relevant here. But one important point that is highlighted by scholars working in areas such as these is that when it comes to telling stories with or through maps, it can be vitally important to connect the maps that you're using with different media forms and a variety of modes of expression if you want to capture something of the emotive link that develops between individuals or groups and certain spaces. So crucially, given their inherent multimediality, story maps allow for the interconnection of cartographies and various strands of our collective research output in a manner that is digitally accessible. So through this multiple media format then, firstly, we can integrate cartography, obviously, as a means of capturing the spatiality of the community of refugees and emigres. So here, for example, I've taken a map that displays the dozens of institutions, organizations, etc., with which the musicians we're looking at were involved. And I've used it as a way of illustrating a point about the cultural and social makeup of the internment camp populations. Wait for a little while longer. And then similarly, in this example, we can see, or eventually we will see, how maps can be used to illustrate the spaces of the internees' narratives themselves. So in this case, the first map that we see here is illustrating part of the journey taken by Hans Gál within internment. And the second one, which will pop up shortly, shows the Isle of Man and its camp network, all in relation to the left-hand narrative, which describes the development of cultural life and some of the ways in which this is framed by the spaces of the camps. So this slide and the previous slide have given us an illustration of how the maps themselves might be used to illustrate the stories. But this one in particular has also begun to suggest the diversity of other sources, topics, and so on that we can incorporate into these maps, allowing us to link wider spatial narratives with particular topics or particular strands of our project. So for example, here, this sequence of story map slides on the topic of conditions within internment camps begins with a particular spatial framing, namely Wharf Mills camp near Bury, and then it proceeds to illustrate a number of different issues through an array of different artifacts. So particularly the narrative text in this instance, as well as one of the right-hand images, which we'll see shortly, and which offers a direct quote, are informed specifically by archival research, which is an important dimension of our project. Similarly, another crucial aspect of music migration and mobility as a project is performance, some examples of which we've already seen this evening. And the multimedia potential of the Story Maps platform offers a similar opportunity to incorporate the performance outputs of the project into a wider conversation that involves geographical data, archival research, and the historical and social context that might surround a particular piece of music. So in this instance, just to provide a very quick example, I've included a brief clip from the map on culture in the camps, just to demonstrate how it might look to include an example of performance alongside cartography. And in this case, it's Peter Gellhorn's Andante. And finally, another significant dimension to our projects is a focus on the stories of individual emigres and refugees, and as such, biographical detail is of significant importance to the maps that I've been producing so far. So in this case, we're seeing a map that takes some excerpts from the diary of Hans Gál and pairs them with moving maps, images, videos, and so on. And this, I think, is perhaps the best demonstration of them all as to how story maps can work in practice. And it offers a good example of how some of the different concerns that I've mentioned can be combined. In all, the purpose of the story maps, as they're embedded within our wider work, is to create as holistic as possible a picture of whatever topic it is that we're looking at, in this case, internment, in a manner that incorporates the varied and sometimes divergent interests of our project and the various members of our team. I could say more, but I think I'd better move on because I have one final topic to introduce. So alongside work on the internment story maps, we've also been collaborating with a colleague, Dr. Giada Patele from the University of Padua, in order to create a number of comics, illustrations and narratives that aim to tell the story of internment and its specific geographies from another perspective. And on the next few slides, I've added a few examples of Giada's work as a kind of preview of this dimension of our output. And Dr. Patele is a lecturer in literary geographies, and she has a wealth of experience in working with comics in really fascinating ways, not only as an object of study, but also as a mode for practicing and representing research. And in fact, I've taken the title of this section of the talk from a recent book, Comics as a Research Practice. And that book is framed as an invitation to undertake comics making as a kind of experimental research methodology, one that, quote, composes counter-narratives by assembling and disassembling geographic narratives in public space. So in effect, we undertook to recreate the story of internment in a way that defamiliarizes it, and one that might begin to ask provocative questions about the spaces in which it unfolded. So we can see here, for instance, an image that quotes directly from the camp review, What a Life, and which assumes a playful attitude toward the notion of barbed wire growing up the shore. So here, the array of different perspectives that we take on the shoreline prompts a kind of visual rhyme between the shape of waves lapping onto the beach and the undulations of the barbed wire that surrounded the camps. In this way, at least to my mind, we're prompted to consider the embeddedness of the camp within this specific local context, but also prompted to consider the juxtaposition to be found in the vast expanse of the sea, with its wide horizon on the one hand, and the cramped confinement inherent to its neighbour, the internment camp, on the other. Similarly, the disassembling and reassembling work of the comics form allows us to investigate facets of the internment story from very different angles to those with which we might tend to be familiar. So here, for instance, on the right-hand side, we can see an example of a section of the comics that's again inspired by What a Life. But this time we have a focus upon the seagull, who was mentioned in the quotes from the review on the previous slide, and as we heard in the music earlier on. A number of pages of the comics were composed from the perspective of a seagull who was reimagined as a non-human actor who expresses a variety of perspectives and opinions on the internment situation to which they are bearing witness. In this instance, we see an expansion upon the line from What a Life, why are human beings behind the barbed wire, or behind the wire, which sees the seagull paired with contemporary newspaper headlines, questioning the sense of mass internment whilst juxtaposing the internee's immobility with its own highly mobile existence. In addition to allowing us to access and consider different and sometimes unusual perspectives on the history of internment, the comics form also allows us to visualize aspects of the experience to which we don't or can't have direct access, be that through photographs, videos, or textual artifacts. So one example of that would, of course, be the perspective and opinions of a seagull, to which we could never have access. But here, for instance, we see an image of Hans Gál, which has been reimagined from other existing photographs. In the act of writing, perhaps his diary, or composing, perhaps the music for What a Life, for instance. And below Dr. Gál, we can see an imagined queue of people awaiting a performance, but also one that carries echoes of free people walking along the promenade past the barbed wire fences of the camp. I'm conscious that I've been talking for a little while now, so I'm going to round off by saying that I hope that it's been interesting for people to see some of the material that we've been working on. And I'll just repeat the point that much of this will be available to view quite soon. The comics are still a bit of a work in progress, with the story maps for this section of our work are kind of coming to a conclusion now. So here are a couple of websites related to our project that you might like to keep an eye on in that regard. And aside from that, I think all that's really left for me to say is thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's the time when we can take some questions. And I wonder, Monica, would you like to sort of moderate that for the next few minutes?
With great pleasure. I don't see anything coming in yet, but I dare say if we just wait a few minutes, they will indeed start flooding in. I have an immediate response. I mean, first of all, that was hugely interesting and very, very moving in parts. And for me, lovely to see, you know, you've talked on and off about your project and the use of these visual elements and the story mapping, and to see it having progressed so beautifully has been a great, great pleasure and delight to me. Okay, before I carry on, I think somebody called Gwendolyn's raised her hand. Gwendolyn, would you like to ask your question yourself? If you want to unmute yourself. Can you hear me? Gwendolyn, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Is that working?
Yes, yes, that's good. Hello.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. I've been in touch with Eva several times before. She probably doesn't remember me. I'm the president of the Kurt Schwitter Society. And of course, it's very sad, really, that Kurt Schwitters and Hans Gál never met, because I'm sure they'd have got on extremely well. Of course, Schwitters was in Douglas camp, was an accomplished pianist, very interested in music, and he, of course, his Ursonate, it was something that he performed at the camp, and the part of the scherzo was actually became a sort of a greeting among the members. And I'd like to know if your group, Michael, regards the Ursonate as music, or if it's too a bit too abstruse to count as a musical contribution to camp life.
Well, perhaps I can answer that, Michael, because I would say that yes, definitely. We have actually performed the Ursonate as part of concerts with my ensemble Emigre, And we did it in actually we shared it out between 4 speakers, but it is definitely a musical piece, and it's also a performance art piece, I think. The Fums beverität se peu gif qui rinsekete, 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 it is sound poetry. And so, I mean, it's great to meet you, Gwendolyn, and indeed the story of Kurt Schwitters, which is of course quite a well-known story of an emigre, and tragically, of course, he died quite soon into his British internment. But it connects very much with our work on music, and I think that I mean, also, I'm just a personal fan.
I can tell by the way you perform it. It's brilliant.
Exactly. Could I just add to that last week, actually on Thursday last week, we had a wonderful in conversation between Jackie Richardson, who's the daughter of Klaus Hinrichsen, who became a good friend of Schwitter's in Hutchinson Camp, and a young journalist called Simon Parkin, who's about to publish a book focusing on the creative life, particularly of Hutchinson, which obviously again will involve Schwitter's in a big way, called The Island of Extraordinary Captives, and that will be available as a recording, Gwendolyn, in due course on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. Yeah, so there's lots of connections. What I was going to say, I'm still waiting for some other questions or comments to come in, but looking at Giada's images, what immediately came to mind is the tremendous potential they have for becoming a graphic novel. And I wonder, Giada, I know you're in the audience and I don't want to put you in a spot by asking you the question directly, but whether Norbert or Michael or indeed Giada herself would like to comment on that. It seems to me that would be a kind of logical next step, because to call them comics to me seems not quite the right word. They're much more than that, aren't they?
I don't know. I think that depends who you ask, because I mean, part of my PhD was focused on comics, and I think the terminology within comic studies, including graphic novels, is generally towards that as a word. But no, absolutely. I think the intention is to, well, I mean, first of all, they are designed to be grouped together in a collection, kind of read as a longer form piece of work. And I think how long the work will end up being is not quite determined yet, because it's still something that we're working on. But I think Giada's idea is that they're going to be kind of flexible sections, if you like, that can be read in sort of different orders and things like that. So I think she's going to be experimenting with how we might put them together and how we might use maps as a way of kind of guiding people through them as well. So we're going to be trying to kind of integrate those two different forms a little bit more closely, I think, in future, as well as expanding upon what's already there.
Tremendous. Any questions? Time is running out. Your last opportunity. Questions, comments, thoughts about the way the project is moving forward, I think would be welcomed, as Norbert said at the beginning. I wanted perhaps just to pick up on two things. I noticed with interest that in the Keep Fit song was a reference, of course, to the British pioneers. And for those who perhaps don't know what that might refer to, that one way out, as it were, of internment for those so desperately wanting to help defeat the Nazis, of course, was to join the Pioneer Corps, which was a non-combatant, mostly, I think I'm right, aren't I, composed of former refugees to this country, but who were able, in a small way at least, to play their part in helping, fight the Nazis. And in due course, many of them entered combatant units. So that's an interesting reference there. The other is actually going off at a quite different tangent, but I was thinking, was it Norbert or I think probably Norbert rather than Michael, this point about, yes, sort of the way you bring your music with you, the way it can build bridges and, sort of be a means of communication in your adopted country as well. I'm thinking of the very recent film, which I must confess I haven't seen. It's no longer on, sadly, but I believe it's absolutely wonderful, called Limbo. I don't know if anybody in the audience has seen it, but it's about a Syrian musician. I can't remember what his instrument is, I must confess, but he ends up in, I think, in Shetland or some remote Scottish island, and through his music sort of forges unexpected relationships. So that's just, sort of very contemporary kind of parallel, perhaps. So, no, I cannot believe there are no comments or questions. It's late, isn't it? Anyway, you know how to get hold. Well, I mean, if you... Yeah. Giada, yes, hold on, let's see what Giada's saying to you.
I had a short comment.
Oh, yes, go ahead, please do.
Albrecht German. It was fascinating for me to see Eva Fox-Gál again. We from Musica Reanimata had in 2010 an evening with her dedicated to Hans Gál. I just wanted to mention that there was also culture in other internment camps like Hay in Australia or in Tatua, and I published on this in my book on the Australian exiles. Quite interesting, perhaps not everyone knows about it, is the music culture in the Kitchener camp in Richborough. I completed an article, will be published in the yearbook of the Research Center for German Austrian Exile Studies. There was also a camp orchestra, they had concerts, and also a camp review, and this must be published this year or next year. I think there has not been done much research on the musical life in the Kitchener camp. This was my comment. Thank you.
No, that's a very good point, Norbert. Is Kitchener a place, a location you've actually been including in your researches?
No, well, thank you very much, Albrecht, for mentioning that, and I very much anticipate your article, and hope that we can add some information about that to the materials that we are creating, and we shall duly quote you, of course, when it comes to that. And also just to say, it's very nice to see you again as well after quite some time, and I'm. It's the work of Musica Reanimata in Berlin is being, very, very important in Germany to look at this legacy of emigre musicians, and it's been going back for 20 years, and there's a huge amount of 30 already. Yeah. So and there are many books you've published. So it's wonderful that you could come tonight.
It was a pleasure.
Very good. Do you think it's time to draw things to a close? I think it probably is. It's good. 9:15. That was absolutely wonderful, as I'm sure everybody will agree. So first of all, huge thanks to Eva, particularly, actually, Eva, it was a real delight to hear you talking from a very personal viewpoint. Michael, to meet you for the first time and hear what you're doing, also a real treat. And Norbert, as ever, many, many thanks. And I'd just like to end, if I may, well, I'm actually wondering whether to hand over to my colleague Aviva. Aviva, I don't know whether you want to take over at this point. Aviva is closely connected with Jewish Renaissance magazine, with whom I've been collaborating on these internment-related events. But also, perhaps, Aviva, you'd like to tell us about what's in store from late October onwards?
Sure. So thank you so much, just to add to my thanks to everyone else. But also, I just want to say a massive thank you to Monica, who has put together the most incredible series, who knows her stuff like nobody else, and who has been part of hooking up, building one session to the next, but hooking up together. Like, she's made for us all over the last few weeks a kind of creative map of everything that was happening in the Isle of Man during internment, across all different art forms, and we're really grateful. So there's two things I want to just tell you about. If you would like to come and experience the real place, and perhaps even see Hans Gál's cabaret, What a Life performed in situ, we're trying to do, pandemic willing, a trip in March. It will run from the 27th to the 30th of March. It's being organised jointly between Insiders Outsiders and Jewish Renaissance, which is my project. And we are also, as part of that, working with the Association of Jewish Refugees to put up a blue plaque. And there will be a ceremony to now officially mark the site as an internment site for the first time. So we'd love you to come and be part of that ceremony and celebration, commemoration, but also celebration of life going on. For more information, either you can contact Monica in Insiders Outsiders for more, or she'll put the link in the chat, I think.
I've just done that, Aviva.
Whole itinerary, brilliant. Thank you. We've got a whole itinerary up on Jewish Renaissance, and we love it. We'd love more of you, as many of you as possible, to participate. But while we're still online and going through this cold winter, we're actually taking things forward. So obviously this series has been about the refugees who were interned and couldn't participate in the war experience, much to their chagrin for many of them. What we're going to go on to do after a week's half-term break is have an 8-week course looking at the refugees who did get to participate in work with the Allied forces or in other ways. So we've got, from the 28th of October onwards, we've got 4 weeks on books. We're showcasing people whose work has been mentioned both in this session and an earlier session tonight, including Charmian Brinstone, Helen Fry, Leah Garrett, who've all written books about refugee involvement as military commandos, as listening and interviewing prisoners of war, in espionage, in propaganda. We're then after that going to do 4 weeks on film, where we've got everything from the story of Elizabeth Friedlander, who was involved in Black Ops propaganda and who the Elizabeth font is named after, to Operation Mincemeat, which is about to become a film with Colin Firth and is currently a West End musical at the Southwark Playhouse. But we've got the family of the real Ewan Montague, who came up with that Operation Mincemeat. His grandchildren are going to be participating in a talk and telling us that story from the inside. So it'd be lovely if you can join us. It's 8 o'clock on Thursday evenings. And again, you can book, Monica's put the information in the chat, that you can book through the Jewish Renaissance webpage. And it's all a joint project with Insiders Outsiders and curated by Monica. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you either on screen or in person in the next few months.
Lovely, thank you very much, Aviva. I'm just quickly going to put that last link in. For those of you who don't know about these things, if you simply click on your computer screens, click on the links, then you will have them on your computer for future reference. Lovely, I think that's enough for one night, Aviva, thanks a lot. And it's going to be a tremendous, did you actually give the title? It's a lovely, I think, as I was not, do you want to just give the full title?
Yeah.
I think I'm quite
Spies, Lies and Secret Missions, the unsung Jewish heroes of World War II. So Spies, Lies and Secret Missions.
Lovely, very good. And there's more to come. Do take a look also at the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website, because as well as all the events that we've already mentioned, there is, for example, on the 16th of December, early evening, there's going to be a tribute to Kurt Jooss, the tremendously important choreographer and dancer who was in, have I got this right? Yes, in Huyton, wasn't he? And it's a centenary of his birth this year, so that's something I've been planning to do for a long time. So it's ongoing, all endlessly fascinating. Good. So once again, thank you, Norbert. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Eva, ever so much. And Gwendolyn and Albrecht and Giada likewise. And we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.